they are withholding some of the documents at the request of the British Secret Service.
There is a box, mahogany, dark with age, its brass hinges gone green at the edges. For 29 years it sat beneath the flagstones of a house that isn't on any tourist map, in a county that doesn't exist on this particular version of the map either. And inside that box, wrapped in tissue paper gone the color of weak tea, there is a single folded letter. This is the story of what happens when that box is finally opened. Not a true story. Not a leaked story. A story I'm telling you, start to finish, because some truths are easier to feel through fiction than through fact. Our story begins with a woman named Eleanor Ashworth, though nobody who mattered ever called her that. To the newspapers of her fictional kingdom, she was the Duchess who ran. To her two sons, she was simply Mum, and to precisely one person in the sprawling, gilded, suffocating family she married into, she was something else entirely, a confidante. That person was her sister-in-law, a woman named Constance, quiet, unglamorous, permanently associated in the tabloids with horses and drizzle and a certain chilly reserve that nobody bothered to question, because it was easier not to. This is the tale of a letter Eleanor wrote 3 weeks before her death in a fictional car accident on a fictional stretch of road outside a fictional city. It is the tale of what that letter said, who kept it, and why none of it happened. All of it, in the way that good fiction sometimes manages, might still be true. The house. The estate is called Bramfield, and it has belonged to the Ashworth family for 400 years, which in itself tells you something about how thick the walls are, how deep the cellars run, how many secrets a house like that can swallow without so much as a creak. Bramfield sits behind iron gates in the invented county of Marchmore, half a day's drive from the capital, close enough to matter, far enough to disappear into. It was here, on a wet Tuesday morning in early spring, that Eleanor's younger brother, a man named Julian, finally opened the vault beneath the old chapel. He had put it off for years, not out of fear exactly, but out of a reluctance to disturb something that felt, in some superstitious corner of his mind, like disturbing his sister's actual grave. He wore white gloves. He always did, when it came to anything of hers. It was a habit he couldn't shake, a way of saying without words, this still matters, even now, even after everything. Inside the box, beneath a stack of old family photographs and a single pressed flower gone the color of dust, was the letter. Pale blue paper, a fine hand, and a date at the top that made Julian sit down heavily in the old oak chair his grandfather used to occupy. 3 weeks, that's what the date told him. 3 weeks before the accident that took his sister from the world. Whatever she had been carrying in those final days, whatever weighed on her enough to write it down and seal it away, rather than simply say it aloud, it was here now, in his hands, 30 years too late to ask her about it directly. The narrative we were told. Before we go further into the letter itself, it's worth pausing on the story the public had always been told about Eleanor and Constance, because understanding the shape of that story is what makes the letter, when it finally surfaces, land with such force. For decades, the popular image was simple, almost lazily so. Eleanor was warmth, the photographs, the causes, the crowds who reached for her hand and somehow always managed to touch it. Constance was distance, the stables, the formal photographs, a woman who seemed to exist at a permanent arm's length from sentiment, a woman the papers loved to describe as unreadable. Two sisters-in-law, the story went, who tolerated each other across the width of a family Christmas table and nothing more. It was a convenient story. It required no further inquiry. It let everyone, the press, the family's own advisors, even casual observers, stop looking for anything more complicated underneath. And convenient stories. As anyone who has spent time around institutions with long memories and longer public relations departments will tell you, tend to serve somebody. The letter itself, what Eleanor actually wrote in this telling, was not addressed to a friend in the ordinary sense. It was addressed plainly to Constance, no title, no formal opening. The kind of intimacy that only exists between people who have decided somewhere along the way to trust each other completely and to never say so out loud. By the time she wrote it, Eleanor's marriage had already ended in all the ways that mattered. She had been quietly stripped of certain privileges that came with a title she no longer fully held. She felt, and the letter apparently said this without much attempt at softening it, that she was being managed rather than heard, that decisions about her son's futures were being made in rooms she wasn't invited into by people whose only real loyalty was to an institution rather than to two boys who needed, more than anything, a childhood. She wrote that she had learned from a source she trusted inside the family's own administrative machinery that there was a plan taking shape, a plan to formalize control over her son's upbringing in a way that would push her, gradually and with impeccable legal cover, to the margins of their lives. She described it, in the letter, as a trap dressed up as tradition. And she asked Constance for one thing, stated plainly, to stand in the way. Not publicly. Not with statements or interviews or grand gestures. Eleanor knew better than anyone how quickly grand gestures got turned into headlines and then into ammunition. She asked her, quietly and privately, to simply be present, to be the kind of steady, unglamorous, undramatic adult presence that two boys who were about to lose their mother's daily protection would need and might not get anywhere else. How it was delivered. In this fictional telling, Eleanor didn't trust the ordinary channels. She believed, rightly or wrongly, the letter itself doesn't resolve that question, that her correspondence was being read by people who had no business reading it. So she used an old informal network of trusted staff, the kind of quiet loyalty that doesn't show up on any organizational chart, to get the letter into Constance's hands directly, without it ever touching an official desk. It went from a locked drawer in Eleanor's private study to the stables at Constance's home, delivered by a driver Eleanor had trusted for a decade, and placed directly into Constance's hands with a single instruction, for your eyes only. It never passed through any office. It never showed up on any log. For 30 years, as far as the wider family and the world were concerned, it simply didn't exist. The second revelation. Midway through the letter, and this is the detail that in our story changes everything a second time, Eleanor mentions something else. An archive, a private collection of her own letters and diary pages kept entirely outside official hands, built up over years, holding pieces of her life that she had never let anyone else see. She tells Constance, almost as an aside, that she has left instructions with people she trusts if she is ever completely cut off from her sons, if the machinery she fears succeeds in pushing her out entirely. This private archive is to be released. Not out of spite, the letter insists, but so that the truth of what happened to her, and why, would not simply be allowed to disappear into an institution's preferred version of events. Whether that archive still exists in our fictional world, nobody currently knows. That's part of the story too. Not every mystery gets resolved, and the not knowing is its own kind of tension. Constance's 30 years. Here is where the story, I think, becomes less about secrets and more about character. Because what Constance did with that letter, and, more importantly, what she did with the 30 years that followed it, says more about who she actually was than any headline ever managed to. She told no one. Not out of coldness, but because she understood, in a way that seemed to elude nearly everyone else around her, that the value of the promise she'd made lived entirely in its silence. She didn't give interviews. She didn't correct the record when the tabloids painted her, year after year, as the frosty, undemonstrative aunt who existed on the family's margins. She let that caricature stand, because correcting it would have meant explaining why, and explaining why would have meant breaking a promise made to a woman who could no longer ask her to keep it. Instead, quietly, without cameras and without announcement, Constance rearranged her own life around two boys who needed her more than the public ever knew. She showed up during school holidays. She walked with them through the grounds of family estates, said very little, asked for nothing, and simply remained present in the specific, unglamorous way that grief actually requires. Rather than the performed way grief so often gets depicted. Nobody applauded her for it, because nobody knew. That, in the end, might be the most quietly radical thing about her. She did the hardest, most important work of her adult life entirely, without an audience. Why it surfaced now. In our story, the letter comes to light 3 decades later, not because of some grand unveiling, but because of something almost bureaucratic, a routine request to digitize and centralize old family archives as part of an anniversary commemoration. Constance is asked to hand over her private papers for review. She refuses, quietly, firmly, without much explanation. That refusal draws attention, the kind of attention that, once it exists, tends to keep pulling at threads until something gives. Julian, Eleanor's brother, learns that Constance has been holding something back for 30 years and travels to see her. What follows in our story isn't a confrontation, but a conversation between 2 people who loved the same woman and have spent 3 decades honoring her in very different, very private ways. Julian tells Constance he believes the truth deserves to exist somewhere beyond 2 people's private grief. Constance, after 30 years of silence, agrees not because she's ready to be seen, but because she recognizes that continuing to hide the letter now would look like something it never was. A cover-up, rather than the quiet act of loyalty it had always actually been. What this fictional story is really about. If you strip away the mahogany box and the pale blue paper and the fictional dukedoms, what's left is a fairly simple, fairly human question. What do we actually owe the people we love when the world insists on telling their story for them? Eleanor, in this telling, understood that she might not be believed, might not be protected, might not even survive long enough to see her sons grown. So she did the only thing available to her. She wrote it down, and she gave it to the one person she trusted not to turn it into a performance. Constance, for her part, understood that the deepest form of loyalty is sometimes invisible, that showing up quietly, for years, without credit, is worth more than any public defense could ever be. It's a story about the gap between how people are perceived and who they actually are. Underneath that perception, the horsewoman who was secretly the steadiest hand in the room. The icon who was, underneath the photographs, a frightened mother trying to build a safety net out of trust and paper and 30 years of somebody else's silence. The questions the story leaves open. A good fictional mystery, like a good real one, doesn't answer every question, and this one is no different. Does the private archive Eleanor mentioned still exist, somewhere in a solicitor's vault or a forgotten storage unit? What exactly did she know about the plan she feared, and how did she come to know it? Who else, in the wider family, might have known this letter existed and chosen, for their own reasons, to say nothing? These are the threads I'd leave hanging if this were a longer story, the kind of open questions that let an audience keep turning a fictional world over in their minds long after the credits roll. That's the job fiction does that straight reporting can't. It lets you sit inside an emotional truth without demanding you accept it as a factual one. Closing. So that's the sealed letter, not a leak, not a discovery, not anybody's real family. A made-up letter. A made-up house, a made-up 30 years of silence between 2 women the tabloids never really understood. But if the emotional core of it landed with you anyway, the mother trying to protect her sons from a distance, the sister-in-law who chose invisible loyalty over public credit, then it did what a story like this is supposed to do. But before we close, let's slow down and sit inside a few more rooms of this story, because there's more here worth lingering on. The morning Julian found the box. Picture it fully. Bramfield's chapel vault isn't dramatic in the way films make these things look. No torches, no cobwebs artfully arranged for effect. It's a small, dry room with a single bare bulb, a concrete floor, and rows of document boxes belonging to 5 centuries of an invented family's paperwork. Land deeds, christening records, tedious correspondence about drainage rights from 1840. Julian had been in this room 100 times. He knew exactly where his sister's box sat, 3rd shelf from the door, and he had walked past it more times than he could count without opening it. That particular Tuesday, he wasn't looking for anything specific. He'd come down to catalog some estate paperwork for an insurance review, the kind of dull administrative task that fills up most of the actual hours of managing an old house. It was almost an accident that he stopped in front of Eleanor's box at all. He has said in our fictional account that he isn't sure what made him reach for it that particular morning rather than any other. Grief doesn't run on a schedule. Sometimes it simply decides the day has come. He carried the box upstairs to the library rather than opening it in the vault, because some instinct told him this deserved better light than a bare bulb could give it. He set it on the same walnut desk his grandfather had used for estate business for 40 years, and it was there, gloves on, that he lifted the lid. The photographs came first Eleanor as a girl in Wellington boots, Eleanor at 18, looking almost unbearably young in a photograph none of the newspapers had ever printed. Then the pressed flower. Then, folded in quarters at the very bottom, the letter itself. He didn't read it standing up. He is described, in our story, sitting down heavily, the way you do when your knees make the decision before your mind has caught up, and unfolding the page slowly, the way you might handle something that could tear if you rushed it. The contents in fuller detail. What follows is an imagined reconstruction of the letter's substance, not a transcription, because in fiction we don't need one, but a sense of its shape and its argument, since that shape is what matters to the story. Eleanor opens by dispensing with any pretense of formality. She writes as though she is mid-conversation, as though the two of them had simply paused a talk they'd been having for years and she was picking it back up. She writes about exhaustion first, not dramatic despair, but the particular tiredness of being watched constantly and trusted rarely. She describes, in the letter, a meeting she wasn't supposed to know about advisors discussing, in the dry language institutions use for the most consequential decisions, how her son's schooling, their security detail, their public appearances should be brought back into structure now that her own role in the family had become, in her words, unsettled. She writes that she understood exactly what that phrase meant, even dressed up in careful language. It meant her influence over her own children's daily lives was being quietly redrawn by people who had never once asked her what she wanted for them. She names, in the letter, a specific fear that if she pushed back publicly, she would be framed as unstable, as difficult, as exactly the caricature certain corners of the press had already been building for her for years. She writes that she has learned, painfully, that the more she insists on being heard through official channels, the more thoroughly she is managed. And so, she has decided to do the one thing that cannot be managed, to write it down, plainly, and put it into hands she trusts completely, outside every official channel that exists. And then she turns to Constance directly. She writes that she has watched her, over the years, at family gatherings that Eleanor herself often found suffocating, has watched the way Constance moved through rooms without performing for anyone, without needing anyone's approval, entirely unbothered by how she was perceived. She writes that she used to find that quality strange, even a little cold, until she came to understand it as something closer to freedom. Constance, she writes, is the only person in the family who has nothing to prove to the institution, and therefore nothing the institution can hold over her. That is why I am asking you, the letter reportedly says, in this fictional rendering, and not anyone else. You do not need their approval. You never have. Whatever they decide to do about me, please do not let them decide who my sons become. It's a short letter, in the end barely a page and a half, front and back, but it is dense with the particular urgency of someone who suspects she may not get a